Okay, good afternoon. Well, thank you all for being here today. For those of you who don't know me, I think you all know me, right? I'm Feng Shenghu, the Richard G. Engelson Dean of Arts and Sciences, and it is my honor to welcome you to the installation of Jonathan Judaken as the Gloria M. Goldstein Professor of Jewish History and Thought. It's so wonderful to see many colleagues and members of our WashU community here today, and I know that some of them are probably just stuck in the traffic. I would also like to welcome everyone joining us via our live stream. Thank you for helping to mark this special occasion. We are especially delighted to have two of Jonathan's family members in the room today, and they are Jenny Judaken, his wife, and Joelle Judaken, their daughter. Would the two of you please stand to be recognized? And I know Jonathan also has family and friends joining us virtually. I would like to thank them for being part of this celebration from afar. Now, installations like this are some of my favorite events as Dean at WashU. It is a time to pause and honor the accomplishments of our distinguished faculty, recognize the generosity of our donors, and reflect on what it means to be a global model for research, teaching, and scholarship. And this brings me to our honoree today, Professor Jonathan Judaken. Jonathan is chair of the Department of Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies, otherwise known as JIMES in Arts and Sciences. In a few minutes, Professor Aaron McLaughlin will share more about Jonathan's impressive career, which includes authoring and editing a broad range of works on the history of anti-Semitism, racism, critical theory, and post-Holocaust French Jewish thought. He has written, edited, or co-edited 7 books, including his most recent monograph, Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism, which was recently published by Columbia University Press. Jonathan has a long history of scholarship that includes serving as a scholar in residence at the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and as a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at Harvard. He is the US contributing editor for the journal Patterns of Prejudice, and serves on the editorial boards for a number of journals on race and Jewish studies. As I mentioned, Aaron McLaughlin will share more about Jonathan's distinguished career in just a few minutes. And now I would like to turn to the namesake of the professorship and a gift that made it possible. This professorship is a gift from Samuel R. Goldstein in honor of his wife, Gloria Mintz Goldstein. It was established in 1980 to strengthen WashU's Jewish studies programs and Olin Library's Jewish literature and artifacts collection. After graduating from Brooklyn College, Samuel served in the Army Air Corps at Scott Air Force Base, where he met his future wife on a blind date. The couple married in 1945, and Samuel joined his father-in-law's company, later known as Apex Oil Corporation. Through Samuel's leadership, Apex grew from a small oil company into a multi-billion-dollar international oil trading, refining, and marketing company. Samuel was an unpretentious man who cherished his privacy and often carried out his philanthropy anonymously or through gifts in his wife's name. How lovely. The Goldsteins had strong ties to WashU. Gloria studied occupational therapy, and Samuel was awarded the university's Second Century Award in year 2000. In addition to the professorship we celebrate this afternoon, Samuel established the David Rabinowitz scholarship in the Brown School, supported scholarships, made substantial gifts to the School of Medicine, and supported the campaign for Washington University. We are extremely grateful for the generosity of donors such as the Goldsteins, whose contributions continue to help us recruit and retain some of the world's most talented scholars, including Jonathan Judaken. I would now like to invite Professor Erin McLaughlin to the podium, and she's going to tell us more about Jonathan's distinguished career.
Thank you, Dean Hu. I'm very pleased to have the privilege of introducing Jonathan Judaken, the Gloria M. Goldstein Professor of Jewish History and Thought. Jonathan is relatively new to the WashU community, having taken up his professorship in fall 2023, and then assumed the position of chair of the Department of Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies in fall 2024. But with his illustrious record of path-breaking scholarship in a number of interrelated fields, including Jewish studies, modern European intellectual history, and the theoretical study of anti-Semitism, areas in which he is widely considered a leading and, in fact, field-defining expert, he now contributes in vital ways to the scholarly profiles of the departments of history and of Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern studies. His transplantation to Washington University thus represents an unqualified gain for us in arts and sciences. Over the next few minutes, I hope to give you a sense of why we are so fortunate to now count him among us. Jonathan is the ideal person to occupy the Goldstein Professorship because his scholarship and public-facing work are in fact grounded in the two areas specified in the title, Jewish history and Jewish thought, in equal measure. As an intellectual historian trained broadly in post-Enlightenment European intellectual tradition and focused specifically on post-Holocaust French discourse, he explores the historical context in which cultural, social, and political theories about Jews, Judaism, and Jewishness have emerged, circulated, and intersected with related debates on race and colonialism. In particular, Jonathan's work interrogates the enduring issue central to the study of modern Jewish history, namely the genesis, evolution, and myriad manifestations of anti-Semitism. In his careful investigation of the so-called Jewish question and the development of the discourse of anti-Semitism in the writing of both Jewish and non-Jewish thinkers, he employs an interdisciplinary approach that combines the rigorous methodologies of the historian with the analytical acuity of the critical theorist. His work thus not only reconstructs the fraught discourse on the problematic of Jewish alterity in modern French and European culture, but it also develops a sophisticated theoretical and conceptual apparatus for evaluating it. Jonathan's early scholarship concentrates in particular on debates on Jews and Jewishness in post-war French society and on the connections and dissonances between anti-Jewish and anti-Black racism. In his first monograph, Jean-Paul Sartre and the Jewish Question, Anti-Semitism and the Politics of the French Intellectual from 2006, Jonathan explores the extended intellectual engagement of the philosopher Sartre with Jews, Judaism, Israel, and anti-Semitism. As he insightfully argues in this book, Sartre's preoccupation with the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, which is fundamental to modern Western thought, was key to the development of his existentialist philosophy and social theory. While Jonathan is incisive in his critique of the ways in which Sartre inadvertently adopts some of the assumptions of anti-Semitism, he also demonstrates the ways in which Sartre's abiding interest in the Jewish question provoked his later thinking in the areas of race, colonialism, and imperialism. Jonathan develops this latter dynamic in his subsequent work, which includes his edited volumes, Race After Sartre, Anti-Racism, African Existentialism, Post-Colonialism from 2008, and Naming Race, Naming Racisms from 2009, which further explore the connections between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism and Islamophobia in modern European thought. In his more recent scholarship, Jonathan moves from a more comparative focus that connects the discourses of racism and anti-Semitism to a more sustained investigation of anti-Semitism itself, which, in his astute evaluation, has been both under-historicized and under-theorized in comparison to anti-Black racism and post-colonialism. In his long-anticipated monograph, Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism, Confronting Modernity and Modern Judeophobia, which appeared last year, he aims to clarify the conceptual confusion about what constitutes anti-Semitism and how it operates by constructing a critical theoretical apparatus that at the same time is rigorously grounded in historical context. In this bold, magisterial, and beautifully written work, Jonathan charges head-on into the contentious arena of current discourse on anti-Semitism, arguing that the time is ripe for a systematic re-evaluation of both the contested concept and the complex history of anti-Jewish ideologies. As he writes in his introduction, quote, "Contemporary discussions about anti-Semitism have consequently become a battlefield, with scholarship caught in the crossfire. It is time to pan back to widen the purview, reflecting on a meta level about how to think about how we think about anti-Semitism. In doing so, I maintain that writing about Judeophobia today demands greater interrogation of our terms, methods, narratives, and epistemologies. It requires that we appreciate the connections between anti-Semitism and colonialism, immigration and xenophobia, the links between gender and Jewishness and between Jews and Muslims and others, and the ties between the post-colonial condition shaped by slavery and imperialism and the experiences of other genocides and the Holocaust. In short, I argue against exceptionalism, eternalism, teleology, apologetics, and theoretical naivete in how scholars approach anti-Semitism," end of quote. As this quotation demonstrates, Jonathan aims to correct the deficiency he perceives in the discourse on anti-Semitism by providing what he calls an entangled history that employs comparative frames and acknowledges a, quote, "history of interlaced pasts," end of quote. By tracing a longer history that connects modern and contemporary anti-Semitism to its ancient and pre-modern variants, as well as by interrogating its multiple overdetermined meanings and its myriad manifestations, he aims not only to provide a more differentiated account of anti-Jewish thought and practice, but also to close the considerable gap between the theorization of anti-Semitism and what he calls, quote, "cognate areas such as critical race, post-colonial, and decolonial theorizing," end of quote. Finally, and most relevant for our current moment, in this groundbreaking work, Jonathan also develops a differentiated vocabulary for the diverse ways in which anti-Semitism manifests in contemporary political and social life. His original and thought-provoking book thus offers a useful methodology for assessing the current political landscape, which has demonstrated a greater tolerance for anti-Semitic discourse on both sides of the political divide. It also provides a critical lens through which we can evaluate the efforts of the current presidential administration, which in the service of a disingenuous agenda reflexively conflates anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism and leftist critique of Israel, and at the same time disavows or downplays the alarming growth of anti-Semitic rhetoric and actions on the part of the right. In this way, critical theories of anti-Semitism not only contribute substantively to the intellectual history of anti-Jewish discourse, but it also provides us with a much needed theoretical framework for assessing our own political and cultural moment, and for constructively intervening in debates in ways that help us avoid the political traps in which they're most often mired. As I hope my quick introduction to his work has demonstrated, as the new holder of the Gloria M. Goldstein Professor of Jewish History and Thought, Jonathan makes a critical contribution to the broader intellectual life of the departments of history and of Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern studies, of arts and sciences, and of Washington University as a whole. Please join me in welcoming him to receive his medal and deliver his installation address.
Okay.
Come over here.
Okay, now we've got our act together.
You
All
guys
right.
may have your act together.
Jonathan, it is my pleasure to present you with this medallion as a signatory of your professorship. On the front, it reads Gloria M. Goldstein, Professor of Jewish History and Thought, Arts and Sciences. On the back, Jonathan Judaken, April 3rd, 2025. All right, you are now officially installed. Scoot over. Picture. All right, congratulations.
Thank you. So I have to say that I didn't expect this would kind of have the vibe of an adult bar mitzvah. But you'll forgive me because that's a little bit what it feels like with all the pictures. I also want to say thank you so much. That introduction was one of those introductions that really makes you flush. And it was so nice to sort of hear channeled what I've been sort of trying to articulate and isn't always easy to capture so beautifully. It makes sense, of course, that you would get it all because we're twin Goldstein chairs. Aaron suggested that maybe we should get some t-shirts made. We're working on logos, if any of you have any good ideas. So, do we have slides? Okay. I want to thank all of you for coming, including my parents and siblings who are watching on the stream, to friends who traveled long distances to be here, and to my new St. Louis family and colleagues. Thank you, all of you, for sharing this honor with me. I'm under no illusions that the work that we do is work that we do alone. My deepest thanks, of course, go to my wife, Janie, without whom none of this happens. But I also do want to do a shout out to my friend, Torbjörn Vandell, who's here, because I don't think there's anyone who's read as much of my work, maybe all of it. He's been my most rigorous editor through almost every single thing that I've written. I really could not have done this work without him. So what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about my work, probably in a somewhat different way than the way that Aaron did, by talking a little bit about how it relates to my life. And I'm going to do so by playing a game that we used to play when I was in graduate school, where we would psychoanalyze someone on the basis of their research. I don't know if any of you played a game that was like that in grad school, but in a way, what I'm going to do is psychoanalyze myself. Now, in my own case, if you know a few things about my background, you'll know that actually this is not that difficult. I grew up Jewish in apartheid South Africa. That's a short sentence, but it has deep significance directly related to the title of my talk, Anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism. In naming my talk Anti-Semitism and Anti-Anti-Semitism, what I was trying to do was to summarize my research in 2 words. And if you wanted to psychoanalyze my research, therefore, you could say that in one way or another, all of my research is about anti-Semitism and anti-anti-Semitism and how it points back to my early childhood growing up Jewish in apartheid South Africa. Let me give you some background to develop this point. If you ever meet someone who's from South Africa, who's Jewish, you can immediately ask them if their family comes from Lithuania, because more than 75%, maybe as many as 90% of the Jews in South Africa have Litvak or Lithuanian heritage. This is because there was a very specific migration chain that came from inside this big triangle in Lithuania to South Africa that was connected to like crazy economic factors. For example, the global trade in ostrich feathers, once a very lucrative industry with a significant presence in South Africa, since there are a lot of ostriches in South Africa. My family was part of this migration chain, coming from a tiny hamlet in northern Lithuania to South Africa. Luckily, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother on my father's side, who never left Lithuania, died just before the Holocaust. This is lucky because Lithuania is also the country that had the highest rate of killing of any other country. Over 90% of the Jews who were in Lithuania were wiped out in what scholars call the Holocaust by bullets, almost all of them within a 3-month period. About 140 members of my family tree, just on my father's side, which is completely documented back to the 18th century, were wiped out in the Holocaust, although not only in Lithuania. And this Lithuanian Jewish community that was largely wiped out was an extraordinary Jewish community at the crossroads of all the currents of modern Jewish life, including all of Yiddish culture, Yiddish theater, Yiddish poetry and prose. Lithuania had some of Europe's greatest yeshivas, some of Europe's most well-known rabbis, including the Vilna Gaon. Lithuania was the site, an important site for the conflict between the rationalists and the mystics, and the Bundists and other socialists, and all of them were in conflict. And they also had their conflicts with the Zionists. All of this played out in Lithuania. When I came as an immigrant to the United States in 1978, when I was 10 years old, the largest surviving community of Lithuanian Jews lived in South Africa. The community at that time was about 130,000. In general, the community were relatively wealthy, even dominating a number of sectors of the industrial economy. And this was quite remarkable because when Jews first arrived in South Africa, they often worked as peddlers to Afrikaners, the descendants of Dutch settlers. But by the 1930s, Afrikaner nationalism had become aggressively anti-Semitic, since really it was a variant of white Christian nationalism akin to Nazism. After coming to power in 1948, however, the South African state made Jews white because every white body counted in a country founded on anti-Black, anti-Asian, and so-called anti-colored racial subordination. Jews, as approximately 5% of the white population, counted for something amidst a white minority population of about 20% who ruled over 80% of the population, who fell into one or another of the three subordinate categories. Most Jews were happy to accept the bargain, putting their heads in the sand, as the popular proverb about ostriches would have it, including my family, which was rather ordinary. While Jews were hugely overrepresented in the anti-apartheid movement, just as they were in the civil rights movement and in most progressive movements in modern history, most Jewish families were like my family, largely passive beneficiaries of a colonial and racial state. In short, Jews were then simultaneously the objects of racialization and complicit with the system of racial segregation known as apartheid that emerged in South Africa in 1948. I came as an immigrant to the United States, having grown up almost entirely in a bubbled existence that was upper middle class, white, and Jewish. Coming to America was a massive change, however. Though I'm white and my native tongue is English, I did so with an accent far stronger than is the case now. I also dressed differently, and I grew up in a different culture to the one I emigrated to in Southern California, and this really began to flip my script. My favorite historian is George Massa, who I write about in a chapter in my new book, Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism. And in his autobiography, Confronting History, which might as well have been the title of my own talk today, Massa talks about how his exile from his privileged upbringing in Germany, along with being a homosexual, gave him the critical vantage point of what he calls double outsiderdom. In my case, I was simultaneously both the quintessential insider and a stranger, which shaped my veil of perception. After completing my BA in philosophy, I went to live in France, since I knew that I needed to learn French, given my interests in French post-structuralism. There, I lived in the Fondation Argentine, the Argentinian dorm, and as such, I was again a privileged outsider. And it was while there that I applied to grad school. When I first offered up a proposal for what I would work on as my dissertation, I proposed a project that would focus on the abstract question of alterity or otherness in Foucault, Deleuze and Guattari, and the Nouveau Philosophe. At the public session where I defended this proposal, since that was the process of our department at the time, it was suggested that I was not interested in the abstract question of the other, but rather more specifically in the Jewish question, or in Jewish questions. This deep interest in Jews and Judaism resulted perhaps from a conversion experience of sorts that I had had, since I spent the prior summer being exposed to ultra-Orthodox yeshiva life in Israel when I went on a trip with a Jewish outreach organization named Aish HaTorah. This deep interest in Jews so I ended up rewriting my dissertation proposal to now focus on Zola and the Dreyfus Affair, Sartre and the 1930s and 1940s, and Jean-François Lyotard and the Carpentras affair, an incident in which the medieval Jewish community in Carpentras was horribly targeted when the hard right were first beginning to come to power in France. But the material on Sartre proved to be so rich that it became the dissertation and then my first monograph. When I first started going to Sartre conferences, I was asked by the Sartrologues, Sartre scholars, why was I interested in Sartre? What answers did he provide to me? Sartre has certainly provided answers to many issues. But for me, I was interested in Sartre more for the questions that he enabled me to consider in historical contexts than for the answers that he provided. Sartre's work is centrally about the relationship between self and other, the power of the gaze, the dialectic of human recognition. In other words, the desire that we all have to be recognized in our humanity, which for Sartre is defined by our freedom. He's interested in the dialectic of domination and subordination, how life is about meaning-making and taking responsibility for the ethics and politics of that meaning-making. And of course, Sartre was one of the great critics of anti-Semitism and racism in the 20th century, and thus, in his oeuvre, he ceaselessly reflected on the questions of Jewishness, Israel-Palestine, and the significance of the Holocaust. In short, Sartre's problems were the problems that I was interested in thinking through. Within a month of completing my dissertation, I got married, and Janie and I went to live for 2 Edenic years in Jerusalem. It was there that I fully immersed in Jewish studies for the first time. So even from this short itinerary, you can hear that really I was a dilettante by training. I started in philosophy. I did my doctorate in history. Half of my coursework was in critical theory because I had gone to UC Irvine because of the Critical Theory Institute. And then the focus of my postdoctoral work was in Jewish studies. And this led me to the 4 main areas that comprise my academic studies: French Jewish history, the intellectual history of existentialism and critical theory, the study of anti-Semitism and racism, and post-Holocaust Jewish thought. Work that started with Sartre and the Jewish question, or with what I called then his anti-Semitism, in the subtitle of my first monograph, developed into broader questions of Sartre's contribution to anti-racism, anti-colonialism, Africana existentialism, and post-colonialism. These morphed into a broader consideration of the genealogy of racisms and a desire to expand the canon of existentialism, and to a compendium of the Tunisian French Jewish writer Albert Memmi, an effort to house a whole library in one book. And finally, into my most recent monograph, which is a summa of sorts, my effort to think about how we think about anti-Semitism, and to offer a history of theories and theorists that have been used to explain anti-Semitism, and then to draw upon this pantheon of thinkers to think through the thicket of issues raised by contemporary discussions of anti-Semitism. So for our purposes today, I want to suggest that all of this body of work can be sorted into a focus on anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism. Indeed, the book that I'm working on now, that I hope to finish this summer, is a source reader, collection of about 180 sources, on Judeophobia and anti-Semitism from its origins to the present. This book is literally what I call the archive of defamation, writ small, of anti-Semitism. But most of my work has been about how people understand anti-Semitism, either to oppose or to counter it or to fight it. It is about anti-Semitism. So in Elad Lapidot's book, Jews Out of Question, a critique of anti-Semitism, he has a few lines in the book that I just may well end up putting on my epitaph, given where we are today. And I'll say more about that. So he writes, the main analytic category of this book, anti-Semitism, was explicitly introduced to the academic discourse with the same meaning in which it is used here more than a decade ago by Jonathan Judaken. So he credits me with the critical introduction of the term anti-Semitism into academic discourse. I could never have imagined that when I began to work on anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism 30 years ago, that we would end up today with a fundamental paradigm shift when it comes to the two sides of this contraction. Today, anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism are wound together in deeply paradoxical ways. If anti-Semitism has occasionally been instrumentalized by parts of the left in recent years as part of their critique of Israel or Zionism, then anti-Semitism has been instrumentalized and weaponized in unparalleled ways by the hard right today. I'm not going to rehearse here the clear anti-Semitism that came out in sporadic moments during the protests in favor of Palestinian liberation post-October 7th, nor the clear anti-Semitism on the hard right and within the MAGA movement, and specifically that of Trump and his allies going back to his first campaign for president, his appointment of white Christian nationalists up and down his administration, Elon Musk's Heil Hitler salute, later imitated by Steve Bannon and others. I want to focus instead on the Trump administration's anti-Semitism. In the aftermath of universities cracking down on the encampment movement across the nation in the spring of 2024, the Trump administration's national policy for combating anti-Semitism is now rolling out with its project very clearly defined. Project Esther is an addendum to Project 2025, and it is the heart of the initiatives the Trump administration has started to instigate as part of its national strategy to combat anti-Semitism just in the last few weeks. As you can see from this slide, the claim of Project Esther is that all those who support the pro-Palestinian movement are actually part of a total fiction that they call the Hamas Support Network. This means any activism that the Trump administration labels as such constitutes aiding a terrorist organization and thus poses an actual security threat for the United States. These are then all people that can be labeled enemy aliens and deported. Project Esther connects the Trump plan to target illegal aliens and to jail them and deport them. Universities are being called upon to report their students and professors engaged in such activities. An army of civilian activists likewise can do the same. The arrest of Mahmoud Khalil from Colombia and Raimasa Ozturk at Tufts and a whole number of other students picked up by ICE for deportation as of this week has horrific echoes of a sordid past that Jews have suffered. This is the stamp of a dangerous authoritarianism rising. This constitutes a fundamental paradigm shift in how anti-Semitism is now being mobilized as part of a hard right-wing political agenda. Anti-Semitism is today being mobilized in the name of beleaguered Jewish students on campus, but it is clearly part of a broader political project set on disrupting higher education and tilting democracy towards illiberalism and white Christian national authoritarianism by instrumentalizing and weaponizing anti-Semitism. So today, both anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism are being instrumentalized and weaponized, and Jews are caught in the crosshairs. Unfortunately, this makes my work more challenging than even I could have imagined. But it also shows why it's not very hard to psychoanalyze me on the basis of my research. If you understand that the focus of my research is anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism, and that ultimately this work grows out of my early childhood experiences growing up Jewish in apartheid South Africa, then you've got what brought me to the work that I do. Ultimately, my work is about upending and opposing the forces and institutions and structures that congealed around my own family and my own upbringing, and that continue to have lasting legacies on families similar to mine. I do not need to mention Elon Musk's name here. We could psychoanalyze him too, based on his upbringing in apartheid South Africa, although his relationship to that past is obviously one of embrace rather than critique. As many of you know, for the past year and a half, when you've asked me how I'm doing, I often respond by saying, I'm living the dream. Because coming to WashU really was, for me, the dream. From now on, if you ask me how I'm doing, I'm going to respond a little bit differently. I'm going to answer, I have to be okay, because there is a lot of work to be done. I'm grateful that my intellectual journey has brought me to do this work here at WashU, alongside all of you. So honored to step into the shoes of prior Goldstein professors of Jewish history and thought, at WashU who have made such remarkable contributions. These are big shoes to step into. And I'm happy to share today one slice of my personal history that animates the work that I do. So thank you for being here to share it with me.
Yes, please. You may sit down. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that captivating speech and truly insightful and timely, thought-provoking comments that you shared with us as well. I'm pretty sure many of you were sitting in the audience thinking that I wish I could take a class with Professor Judaken. So I want to thank all of you for joining us as well today, including those joining us virtually. And if you are here, please join us for the reception out there. This concludes the formal portion of today's ceremony. Thank you.